Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to deconstruct something that I think most of us take completely for granted, and that's the origins of English literature as an academic subject. We tend to think of English as this timeless, totally natural subject, right? Kind of like math or physics, like it's just always been there. Well, get ready for a massive rug pull today, because it is actually a highly constructed invention. It's a deeply fascinating journey that uncovers how the books we read are intimately tied to history, class, and society. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this, so let's just get right into it.
I want you to think back to your own experiences in an English class. Picture yourself sitting at a desk, maybe analyzing a Shakespeare play, or struggling through a thick Victorian novel. Have you ever actually stopped to ask, why does this subject even exist in the way that it does? Like, where did this specific academic discipline come from, and what purpose was it actually originally meant to serve?
Okay, let's dive into this by jumping back to 18th century England to shatter a really massive modern assumption. Today, we naturally assume literature just means fiction and poetry, right? But back then, it meant the entire body of valued writing in society. We're talking philosophy, history, essays, even sermons. The defining factor of literature wasn't whether it was made up or imaginative, it was whether it conformed to the standards of quote-unquote polite letters. To put that into perspective, a well-written, incredibly snobby essay on gardening by a wealthy gentleman, that would absolutely be considered literature. But a highly creative, fantastical, fictional story written by a poor person? Not literature. No way. It was all about embodying the values and tastes of a very particular, polite social class.
The lens for our exploration today is Terry Eagleton's foundational text, Literary Theory and Introduction. Now, when this book was published, it absolutely shook up the academic world, mainly because it totally stripped away the romanticized mystique of studying books and instead treated the subject like a political artifact. We'll be walking through his rigorous historical analysis of how the definition of literature evolved. We're going to impartially examine how shifting class dynamics, political power, and ideology fundamentally shaped what we now call English.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First up, we'll look at the invention of literature. Second, the Victorian failure of religion. Third, its surprising early demographics for women and workers. Fourth, the impact of war and national identity. Fifth, the Cambridge Revolution. And finally, number 6, the modern literary crisis.
Part 1. The invention of literature. From facts to imagination.
Let's follow this evolution. From the broad, polite letters of the 18th century, we jump forward to the 1820s, which is the Romantic period. Here, literature suddenly becomes almost entirely equated with imaginative and visionary work. But why? Well, it's because the Romantics were heavily reacting against the utilitarian, profit-driven ideology of early industrial capitalist England. Picture it, the sudden massive expansion of the Industrial Revolution. You've got choking smoke, grueling factories, a relentless focus on mechanical production and profit. To write about something imaginary became this soul-stirring defense against that drab, factual, mechanized reality. And by the 19th century, this elevation of the imagination over hard facts would be transformed into a highly effective ideological tool.
Part 2. The Failure of Religion, a Victorian Crisis.
So, in the mid-Victorian period, religion, which had traditionally been the ultimate, unquestioned social cement holding a turbulent society together, was failing. Rapid industrialization was totally upending traditional community life, and massive scientific breakthroughs, particularly Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, were causing the church's ideological dominance to just evaporate. The ruling class was panicking, society was fracturing, and they realized they needed a new, remarkably similar discourse to step in, pacify the masses, and foster a contemplative inner life without, actually challenging the social order. And the answer they found? English literature. This brings us to a rather startling historical perspective. George Gordon, who was an early professor of English literature at Oxford, stated quite literally, "England is sick, and English literature must save it, to save our souls and heal the state." It is almost absurd to think about today, isn't it? Prescribing poetry to cure a political rebellion. But literature wasn't just viewed as a casual academic pursuit back then. It was explicitly positioned as a spiritual and political cure meant to step right into the massive void left by the failing church.
Part 3. For women and workers, the early demographics.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that English as an academic subject didn't actually start in elite universities. It was first institutionalized in mechanics institutes and working men's colleges. It was literally the poor man's classics. It was designed to give the working class pride in their national language, promote sympathy across classes, and, crucially, curb any disruptive tendencies toward collective political action. At the exact same time, it was deemed a suitably untaxing subject for women, who were excluded from the supposedly manly rigors of science and the classics. The historical sexism and extreme elitism here are almost laughable now, but back then, reading poetry was deemed absolutely perfect for women and workers, while the serious business of ruling the world and studying Greek was strictly reserved for the elite male establishment.
Part 4. War and National Identity. The Imperialist Agenda.
By the time we reach World War I, English literature rides to power on the back of wartime chauvinism. See, before the war, the rigid historical study of language, known as philology, was highly respected. But because of the conflict, philology was suddenly smeared as ponderous Germanic nonsense. In its place, an essential English literature was fiercely promoted. Reading the great English poets became this ultimate act of national pride. It offered intense spiritual solace, so much so that soldiers were famously given little pocketbooks of English poetry to carry with them right into the trenches. It reaffirmed a deeply shaken national identity amidst the absolute horrors of the Great War.
Part 5. The Cambridge Revolution. Redrawing the Map.
Following the war, a new generation of academics at Cambridge completely blasted apart the old assumptions. This wasn't just a minor academic shift, folks, it was a hostile takeover. These were people largely from the provincial lower middle class, and they were actively rebelling against the old patrician elite. Central to this was the Scrutiny Journal movement, led by figures like F.R. Leavis, and this brilliantly illustrates how they argued that English wasn't just a subject, it was the supremely civilizing pursuit. For them, literature was the spiritual essence of society, standing as the very last line of defense against the trivializing, Philistine features of modern industrial capitalism.
To achieve this, the Scrutiny movement boldly redrew the literary map with, honestly, breathtaking elitism. Authors like Shakespeare, Jane Austen, and T.S. Eliot made up the core in list. They were the vital center of human values. Meanwhile, absolute titans like Charles Dickens were initially relegated to the B-roads. Yeah, you heard that right. The writer widely considered the greatest Victorian novelist today was temporarily demoted, which just goes to show how arbitrary and constructed these literary canons truly are. Furthermore, almost all contemporary writers after D.H. Lawrence were totally dismissed. They were effectively constructing an alternative organic society through literature, meant exclusively for a select moral vanguard who could properly appreciate a poetic nuance.
Part 6. The Modern Literary Crisis. The Collapse of Universality.
For decades, students were taught to encounter a literary text from a disinterested, universal viewpoint. The elite essentially thought they were reading from a neutral, almost godlike perspective, completely ignoring the fact that their views were deeply biased by their own wealth, race, and gender. But as universities slowly became more diverse, working-class students, ethnic minorities, and women began to realize something profound. So the crucial point is, those supposedly universal values weren't universal at all. They were specific ideological constructs tied directly to social power. The idea that there was one single natural correct way to read literature just totally collapsed under modern scrutiny.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Next time you take a look at the books on your own shelf, ask yourself, do they simply represent timeless, universal human values, completely independent of history and politics? Or are they the result of a carefully constructed ideological tool, shaped by the needs of an empire, the fears of a ruling class, and the ever-shifting definitions of what it actually means to be human? It's a whole lot to think about, isn't it? Thank you so much for exploring this remarkable history with me today. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.